May 3rd, 1945, 14:27 hours, Shuri Village, central Okinawa. Sachiko Miyagi gripped her 4-year-old daughter Yuki tightly as the beams above their heads creaked under the weight of the collapsed structure. The American bombardment had ended nearly 20 minutes earlier, but what had been their home was now little more than a tomb, the pressure of the debris growing heavier with each minute. From the gap where their kitchen window once was, Sachiko caught the sound of unfamiliar voices. They were speaking English. American troops were inside the village. Everything drilled into the population by the military police meant only one outcome: rape, torture, and death for any civilian discovered. She clamped a hand over Yuki's mouth, desperate to prevent the smallest sound. Then came something she could hardly comprehend. A voice in broken Japanese, "Dareka imasuka? Tasukemasu." "Is anyone there? We'll help you." When Private Danny Kowalski of Detroit crawled through the wreckage and reached them, Sachiko expected her life to end. Instead, the young soldier carefully removed the beam crushing her legs, lifted Yuki to safety, and then came back for her. As machine gun fire rattled overhead from Japanese positions, he covered them with his own body while leading them toward the American aid station. For civilians who had been trained to expect nothing but slaughter at the hands of American demons, the most astonishing revelation of defeat came not from cruelty, but from the sight of enemy soldiers risking their lives to save the very people they had been told to exterminate. The campaign of fear had been all-encompassing. Okinawan villagers had been systematically conditioned to dread capture, with propaganda designed to block surrender and guarantee resistance, even when the end of the war was inevitable. Radio broadcasts, official proclamations, and local meetings had for months painted Americans as less than human, sadistic monsters who committed atrocities for pleasure. The propaganda centered on racial hatred, describing US soldiers as mixed-blood fiends, without honor, mercy, or humanity. Children were taught songs glorifying Japanese who chose death over capture. In classrooms, students learned that falling into American hands meant fates worse than death: torture, mutilation, degradation, making suicide the only honorable course. Community leaders repeated military orders: anyone showing a white flag or attempting surrender would be executed as a traitor to the emperor. Families were instructed to kill themselves rather than be taken. Weapons and poison were handed out specifically for mass suicides. By the time US troops reached these villages, the psychological conditioning was so thorough that many truly believed death was preferable to capture. Entire families chose suicide rather than risk falling into the hands of enemies described as worse than demons. When American units pushed through Okinawan settlements, they encountered communities terrorized by their own government into choosing death over surrender. The discovery of families who had killed themselves instead of accepting protection left American soldiers shaken, struggling with the realization that their very presence had driven civilians to such desperate ends. Urban battles to clear Japanese defensive lines inevitably spilled into neighborhoods where families had been unable or unwilling to evacuate. Soldiers found themselves fighting entrenched enemies while simultaneously trying to protect non-combatants caught between two armies with no safe way out. Although official orders emphasized safeguarding civilians, the brutal reality of combat made this nearly impossible. Japanese troops frequently used civilian homes as defensive positions, leaving Americans to make split-second decisions torn between military objectives and humanitarian obligations under constant threat to their own lives. For many American servicemen, this was their first time encountering civilian populations. Earlier Pacific campaigns had mostly been fought on remote islands with military garrisons. The sudden presence of families, the elderly and children in combat zones demanded tactical and psychological adjustments beyond anything in their training. The first direct encounters between US soldiers and Okinawan civilians began in April and May 1945, as the fighting moved through populated areas where families had been unable to reach evacuation sites. These encounters shocked both sides, destroying preconceptions about what the enemy was. Corporal Bobby Martinez of San Antonio had fought through 2 years of Pacific campaigns and expected nothing but fanatical resistance. What he found instead were terrified families hiding in ruins, situations his military training had never prepared him for. "We found them everywhere," he wrote to his wife. Old people, women, children hiding in basements and bombed-out houses. They were so frightened they couldn't even cry when they saw us. Some tried to kill themselves rather than be captured. We had to move slowly and gently to prove we wouldn't hurt them. Civilian reactions to American soldiers ranged from outright terror and suicide attempts to cautious acceptance, as evidence mounted that the troops intended protection rather than harm. Establishing trust often required hours or days of patient actions to prove humanitarian intent. American medical staff soon faced conditions more severe than anything they had seen before. Many civilians had gone without food, clean water, or care for weeks while hiding as the fighting destroyed infrastructure and disrupted basic services. Staff Sergeant James Sullivan had been trained to treat battlefield wounds, not malnourished children and elderly people struggling to survive. His medical kit was designed for trauma, not infections, starvation, and disease. They were in terrible shape, Sullivan noted in his reports. Kids with untreated infections, old people dehydrated and starving, mothers trying to care for families with nothing. We gave them water, food, medicine, whatever we had. But it was clear they had been suffering for a long time. The care provided to civilians quickly became one of the clearest demonstrations of American humanitarian commitment. Professional treatment, given regardless of nationality or status, proved that Americans valued life itself, even the lives of those once considered enemies. Communication barriers between American troops and Japanese civilians created chances to show intent through deeds rather than words. Simple actions, handing out water, sharing food, tending to the injured, conveyed concern and humanity across the language divide. The few soldiers who spoke Japanese became vital go-betweens, able to explain American intentions and reassure people that the protection offered was real, not a trick. These men often acted as cultural bridges, connecting groups who had been taught only to expect the worst of each other. One of them, Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, a Nisei from California, soon learned how essential his skills were in reaching civilians. Seeing a Japanese American in US uniform shattered deeply rooted assumptions about American racial policies. When they found out I was Japanese American, they couldn't believe it, Yamamoto later recalled. They thought all Japanese in America had been killed or enslaved. Learning that my family was alive, that I had grown up American but kept Japanese traditions, challenged everything they thought they knew. Children often responded first to kindness. Their natural curiosity and resilience made them more open to gestures from strangers, and their reactions frequently influenced the adults around them. Gifts of candy, chewing gum, and small toys to Japanese children became undeniable evidence that Americans had ordinary human feelings and cared about children. Such acts gradually persuaded skeptical adults that this behavior was policy, not just random exceptions. 8-year-old Hiroshi Nakamura had been hiding with his family inside a bombed-out school when American soldiers stumbled on their shelter. At first terrified, he grew fascinated when Corporal Eddie Rodriguez offered him chocolate and tried speaking with simple phrases from a Japanese handbook. The soldier smiled at me, Hiroshi recalled decades later. He had kind eyes, not monster eyes like we had been told. I didn't know what chocolate was. I had never seen it before. But the taste was wonderful, and the man looked happy that I enjoyed it. Many rescues of civilians forced American personnel to put themselves directly into danger. To pull people out of burning homes, collapsed buildings, or areas under live fire demanded courage beyond the expectations of military duty. These missions showed a commitment to civilian safety that went far beyond necessity and directly contradicted Japanese propaganda portraying Americans as cruel and ruthless. Private First Class Tony Rizzo from Brooklyn repeatedly stepped forward for these perilous operations. His willingness stemmed from childhood experience in city tenements where fires and building collapses were common. I grew up in places where buildings went down and people got trapped all the time, he explained. When I saw civilians buried in the rubble, I couldn't just walk away. Sure, it was dangerous with snipers still around, but how could anyone leave children behind? During such rescues, Japanese snipers often had civilians in their line of sight. Many hesitated to fire, unwilling to risk killing their own people. This restraint created small openings that allowed Americans to carry out evacuations that otherwise might have been impossible. These encounters revealed the complicated reality of war involving civilian populations, where military goals and humanitarian needs clashed constantly. In some cases, American operations succeeded precisely because Japanese soldiers shared concern for civilian lives, despite being enemies. Such moments of indirect cooperation showed that even in the chaos of combat, shared humanity could briefly outweigh the demands of war. Both American and Japanese personnel were affected by this moral complexity, their assumptions about absolute enmity tested by the presence of innocents in the middle of battle. American forces also gave out supplies regularly. Despite the strain on their own logistics, troops shared rations, medical equipment, and basic goods with civilians. This generosity was systematic and consistent, showing a policy-level commitment to humanitarian care rather than isolated acts of charity. Military rations, tins of meat, crackers, chocolate, even cigarettes, often offered better nutrition than civilians had known in months. To many, the casual way Americans distributed valuable goods was astonishing. It suggested an abundance of resources far beyond anything the Japanese military could imagine, reinforcing the sense of industrial strength behind the occupation. Mess Sergeant Frank Kowalski supervised much of this distribution. He and his kitchen staff often prepared hot meals specifically for civilians, working long hours to cook food that was easier for children and the elderly to digest. We made extra rice, added vegetables to soup when we could get them, tried to prepare meals that wouldn't be too heavy, Kowalski remembered. These people were starving, and we had more than we needed. It wasn't heroism, just basic decency. Equally important was cultural respect. American soldiers, often briefed about Japanese customs, removed their shoes before entering homes, bowed when meeting elders, and respected family bonds. Such actions ran directly against the propaganda that painted them as uncultured brutes. Efforts to provide culturally sensitive assistance went beyond surface gestures. Units sought interpreters, tried to prepare foods familiar to civilians, and observed religious practices. Military chaplains cooperated with Buddhist priests and Shinto practitioners, offering spiritual comfort to people grieving family members and destroyed homes. This willingness to honor local traditions impressed many civilians. It also contradicted claims that Americans would persecute other religions. The consistency of respectful behavior across different units showed this wasn't just individual kindness, but reflected institutional values and training. Medical efforts often looked miraculous to civilians. With access to antibiotics, surgery, and modern medical techniques, American doctors saved lives that would have been lost under the limited resources of wartime Japan. Children treated for infections or injuries recovered in ways that astonished entire communities. Parents who saw their children restored to health became advocates for cooperation with American authorities. Army physician Dr. Robert Sterling, tasked with civilian care, treated everything from malnutrition and pneumonia to long-neglected war wounds. His mobile unit became a crucial hub of trust. "We saw it all," Sterling wrote. "Kids with infected cuts, old people with pneumonia, families who had been surviving on grass and scraps. The medicines we gave, antibiotics, vitamins, even basic care, made differences they thought were miracles." American engineering units frequently gave priority to repairing civilian infrastructure alongside their normal military construction duties. Rebuilding water systems, restoring electricity, and reopening transport routes all signaled a commitment to community survival, not just battlefield success. Combat engineers who had been trained to construct fortifications and supply depots suddenly found themselves fixing schools, hospitals, and public halls. These projects required both manpower and materials that could easily have been devoted to strictly military aims, but leadership saw the restoration of civilian life as strategically essential. Japanese civilians watching this effort unfold were impressed by the speed and scale of American organization. The efficiency of engineering units revealed capacities most had never seen even from their own government during peacetime. Captain William Hayes commanded one such battalion. His men worked relentlessly, often around the clock, to bring water plants back online, repair power lines, and reopen transportation links in central Okinawa. "We weren't just winning battles," Hayes reported to his commanders. "We were showing people that Americans could build as well as destroy, that we cared about their towns and their futures, not only about defeating their soldiers." Education became another area of focus. Temporary schools and improvised learning centers were organized for children whose education had been torn apart by combat and displacement. These classes offered more than reading and writing. They provided stability and a sense of normalcy during upheaval. American personnel with teaching experience volunteered to work with surviving Japanese educators. Together, they created programs blending American resources with Japanese traditions. This cooperation showed respect for intellectual and cultural continuity, even as war-torn communities struggled to regroup. Books, pencils, paper, and other supplies, scarce for months, were suddenly available. To many families, this commitment to educating enemy children suggested confidence in a future of peace beyond immediate military goals. Teachers often described these experiences as personally meaningful, despite the difficulty of cross-cultural lessons under occupation. Japanese children's eagerness to learn and their quick adaptation left strong impressions on American volunteers, softening attitudes on both sides. The combined effect of all these efforts was psychological transformation. Slowly, Japanese civilians began shedding propaganda-induced fears and recognizing their former enemies as protectors rather than monsters. This change usually came gradually. It took repeated evidence that American promises of safety were sincere. Still, those who had received help themselves often became advocates within their communities, spreading trust where suspicion had reigned. The process was uneven. Some remained skeptical for months, unable to abandon ingrained fears. Others adjusted quickly as direct experiences contradicted everything they had been told. Children adapted the fastest, forming friendships with soldiers who handed out sweets or played simple games. These bonds often convinced adults more effectively than official assurances. To see children laughing with foreign soldiers proved more persuasive than words alone. Strategically, this humanitarian conduct achieved what brute force could not. By demonstrating values through action, Americans created relationships that supported occupation policies and made reconstruction smoother. Civilian cooperation provided intelligence on remaining Japanese resistance, helped with administration of occupied zones, and supported economic revival that ultimately benefited both sides. The investment in human welfare yielded returns far greater than its cost. Foreign observers took note. Reports about American treatment of Japanese civilians offered evidence of democratic ideals, bolstering diplomatic efforts to forge new post-war alliances. Mercy toward defeated populations granted the U.S. moral authority that went beyond battlefield victories. Among remaining Japanese troops, word of civilian treatment spread quickly, undermining propaganda and encouraging surrender rather than futile resistance. Personal stories added depth to this picture. Accounts from both American servicemen and Japanese civilians gave human faces to policy. They revealed the emotional weight of offering kindness to former enemies while still coping with combat trauma. For many soldiers, the shift from fighting to protecting was not easy. Some wrestled with the contradiction of saving people whose government had tried to kill them weeks earlier. The emotional adjustment was as demanding as the physical dangers of war. On the civilian side, those who accepted help often felt conflicted, grateful for survival, yet guilty to rely on the enemy when their own military had abandoned them. These emotions of survival, loyalty, and shame created inner struggles that took time to heal. Yet out of these hardships, personal bonds formed. Soldiers and families built relationships that endured beyond the immediate crisis. Such ties laid emotional groundwork for broader reconciliation between nations once locked in bitter combat. The greatest paradox of the American presence on Okinawa was that the same forces capable of vast destruction also revealed extraordinary compassion toward the very people they had been fighting. This contradiction disrupted simple ideas about war and highlighted the complexity of human behavior under pressure. For Japanese civilians who directly experienced these rescues, the clash between the expected cruelty and the reality of kindness produced deep cognitive dissonance. It forced them to reassess their understanding of what defined enemies, allies, and humanity itself. The encounters showed that people could rise above national divides and ideological barriers. American soldiers who carried out rescues discovered that those they had fought shared the same essential human needs and emotions. Recognizing this created empathy that crossed the boundaries of politics and military objectives. In the end, what shocked civilians most was not American military might, but the compassion that saved lives at the risk of soldiers' own safety. That memory outweighed years of propaganda about brutality, because it came from personal experience rather than imposed ideology. Those who survived often admitted they could hardly believe Americans had risked their lives for them. The disbelief endured, not because the rescues seemed false, but because they seemed almost impossible in a world where enemies were expected only to hate. For many, the discovery of compassion from former foes represented hope that human nature could rise above the worst instincts of war. For the American soldiers who chose humanity over hatred, mercy over vengeance, and protection over destruction, their choices proved that democratic values could survive even the harshest trials. They showed that true strength was measured not just by the power to kill, but by the courage to save. The memory of those rescues became proof that former enemies could one day be friends, that war could contain mercy alongside violence, and that individual acts of compassion could plant seeds of peace that grew into decades of friendship between nations once bitterly opposed. American hands reached through the rubble to pull Japanese civilians toward safety, guiding them not only out of immediate danger, but into the possibility of a shared future, one built on the fragile but enduring recognition of common humanity.